It was the kind of cold that felt wrong. Not the usual winter bite you expect in the woods of northern Minnesota. This cold, it went under your skin, down to the bone, like it wanted to live there. I was staying in a cabin just outside Ely, a place I'd rented for a month to get away from everything. My phone barely had a signal, the nearest store was 10 miles away, and at night the only sound was the wind screaming through the trees. I told myself that's what I wanted, quiet. The locals had their way of making you feel welcome, in a polite but distant kind of way. But there was one thing they all seemed to do, no matter who I spoke to, they told me not to wander too far into the woods at night. Some would say it outright, like a warning. Others would just glance toward the tree line and mutter something under their breath. It wasn't until my third week there that I found out why. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind was howling louder than usual, and the cabin walls creaked like something was leaning on them from the outside. At around 1 a.m., I saw movement through the frost-coated window. Now, I know what deer look like. I grew up in the Midwest. I've seen them run across roads, graze in fields. But this wasn't a deer. At first, I thought it was a man, tall, too tall, standing perfectly still between the pines. Then it stepped forward into the moonlight, and my stomach dropped. Its arms hung too long, fingers almost brushing the snow. The skin was pulled so tight over its bones that it looked ready to tear. And its head, it looked like it had antlers, but not clean or symmetrical. More like splintered pieces of bone pushing through where they shouldn't be. It didn't move like an animal. It didn't breathe like an animal. It stood there, tilting its head like it was listening to something I couldn't hear. I backed away from the window, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. That's when I heard it, the crunch of snow. Slow, deliberate steps, circling the cabin. I killed the light, crouched behind the couch, and tried to control my breathing. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Then came the smell, rotting meat, wet earth, and something metallic. It was so strong I had to cover my mouth. When I dared to look up, I saw the shadow stretching across the window. And I swear to God, it was smiling. The thing stayed there for what felt like hours. I didn't sleep. By morning, there were no tracks in the snow. None. Like it had never been there at all. The next day, I went into town to pick up supplies and casually mentioned it to the old man who ran the general store. He didn't laugh. He didn't call me crazy. He just said, "You saw it because it wants you to see it. You should leave." The frost was sharper the next morning. I could hear it, yes, hear it, crackling against the glass of my motel window in Grand Marais, Minnesota. I hadn't slept much. Every time I closed my eyes, the sound of those bones snapping in the woods came back. I sat up, pulled my coat over my shoulders, and stared at the faded wallpaper in my room. The motel owner, an old man named Dennis, had warned me about going out too far past the Devil Track River. He told me in that slow, trembling way Midwesterners speak when they don't want to say too much. I should have listened. But I didn't. By noon, I was back on the trail, this time in the daylight, thinking maybe I could find some logical explanation. Tracks. A dead deer. A hunter's camp. Something to tether me back to reality. I took the Gunflint Trail up into the edge of the Superior National Forest. Pines rose like black spires on either side, and snow swallowed every sound. I'd read about this area before, about how the Ojibwe people refused to hunt certain sections in the dead of winter. They said the hunger spirit moved here when the lakes froze. I found the spot again, where I'd heard the screams the night before. But now, under the noon sun, I saw prints. Not deer. Not bear. Feet. Human, but twisted. The toes were too long, curling into the snow like claws, and the stride was wrong, far too long for any normal man. I crouched, my breath puffing in clouds. My hands shook. I wanted to turn around. I should have turned around. But something made me follow them. The tracks wound deeper into the woods until I reached a clearing I didn't remember from before. At the center was a cabin, or what was left of it. The roof sagged, one wall had collapsed inward, and the front door was hanging by one rusted hinge. On the porch sat a metal pot, frozen solid. And beside it, a single mitten. Small. Blue. For a child. I called out, quietly, not expecting an answer. But one came. It wasn't a voice. It was a knock. From inside the cabin. 3 slow knocks. My chest went tight. The woods felt suddenly too still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I stepped toward the door. Every part of me was screaming not to. The inside smelled like rotten metal. The floor was covered in a thin film of ice where water had leaked through the roof. Against the far wall, something was standing. Its back was to me. At first I thought it was a man, tall, emaciated, with torn flannel hanging off its frame. But then it turned, and I saw its face, or what was left of it. The woods in northern Minnesota aren't like the forests you see in postcards. They're older, darker, roots tangled like veins, ground soggy with decades of decay, and a silence that presses on you like a weight. I had been staying in a small cabin near Grand Marais, just a few miles inland from Lake Superior. It was early February, The kind of winter where snow doesn't fall in flakes, but in sheets, endless and suffocating. I'd gone up there to get away from the noise, to clear my head, but I wasn't alone for long. A man named Dale owned the cabin next to mine, if you could call next, a quarter-mile away. He was in his late 60s, with skin like dried leather and a voice that always sounded like it was straining to whisper. The first time I met him, he didn't say hello. He just looked at me, then at the tree line, and muttered, "You hear it yet?" When I asked what he meant, he didn't answer. It wasn't until 3 nights later that I understood. The wind that night wasn't normal. Up here, it usually howls through the trees, but this was different, longer, higher pitched. It didn't fade like wind does. It rose. A sound that clawed its way into your bones. I pulled on my coat and stepped outside. The moon was just a thin slice in the sky, but it was enough to see that something had moved the snow in strange ways, long, narrow drag marks, almost like someone had been walking barefoot, with toes digging deep. That's when I saw Dale, standing at the edge of the forest, his rifle in one hand, the other raised to his lips in a silent warning. I should have stayed back. I should have listened. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. I walked over, crunching snow under my boots, and he whispered without turning his head. "It's been here since last night." Before I could ask, the sound came again. Not far this time. It was almost human, almost, but the pitch and tone twisted in a way that made my stomach drop. Imagine a scream, stretched until it's barely holding together. Dale gripped his rifle tighter. "Don't look in its eyes," he said, still staring into the woods. "That's how it gets in." I thought he was being dramatic, until something moved. Between 2 birch trees, I caught a glimpse of it. Tall. Too tall. Its body was so thin it seemed impossible for it to stand. The head was wrong, elongated, with skin stretched tight over sharp bone. And those eyes, reflective, like an animal's at night, but too forward-facing. Too knowing. It didn't come closer. It just stood there, watching us, the sound in the air fading into a deep, unnatural quiet. Dale slowly stepped back, urging me toward the cabin. "You don't run," he whispered. "It follows faster when you run." We backed up through the snow, and though I didn't hear it move, I knew it had shifted. Every few steps, I saw that unnatural shape again between the trees, as if it was keeping pace without touching the ground. When we finally made it to Dale's porch, he didn't go inside. He just stood there, looking out into the woods, muttering something low under his breath, something I didn't recognize, maybe Anishinaabe. Then, nothing. We waited, and eventually, the forest sounds returned, the creak of trees in the wind, the far-off crack of ice shifting on the lake. Dale finally looked at me. You see it, you don't tell it you've seen it. That's the only reason we're standing here right now. That night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, Dale's cabin was empty. His truck was still there. His rifle was still leaning against the porch railing. But he was gone. And in the snow, just beyond the tree line, were those same barefoot drag marks, leading deeper into the woods. I didn't even realize how far we'd gone until my phone buzzed with a weak signal warning. The screen was barely lit, but the GPS showed our blue dot floating somewhere near Brimley State Park, just a short distance from the frozen shore of Whitefish Bay. We hadn't seen a single set of headlights for hours. The snow swallowed all sound, and even when we stopped walking to catch our breath, it felt wrong. Like the world had gone hollow. Liora, David whispered. Do you hear that? At first, I thought it was the wind again. A low, moaning howl that seemed to sweep through the trees. But it didn't fade, it shifted, like it was circling. The moon was just enough to paint the snow silver, and that's when I noticed it. Prints. Not human, not animal. The shape was wrong, elongated, but almost skeletal. And the stride was too wide for a deer. We followed the trail with our eyes, but they vanished at the edge of the frozen bay. I don't think we should, I started, but David raised his hand. Shoo, look. Out on the ice, something stood. At first, I thought it was a man, tall, ragged, hunched like it had been starving for months. But its arms were too long, its joints bending at angles that made my stomach knot. And then, it moved. Not walking, gliding, jerking forward in quick, unnatural bursts. Each motion was wrong, like a puppet yanked by strings. David's breath caught. No, that's not. The thing stopped. Its head tilted, slow and deliberate, until it was looking right at us. Even from that distance, I swear I could see its eyes, black pits that swallowed the moonlight. It opened its mouth, and the sound that came out wasn't a growl. It was a scream, only it wasn't human. It was my scream. The snow crunched under my boots as I pressed forward, the wind slicing through my jacket like it wasn't even there. My breath came out in short, hot clouds that vanished almost instantly in the frigid air. Somewhere far below, Lake Superior lay frozen under a blanket of moonlight, its ice groaning like some giant, ancient creature shifting in its sleep. I was in the woods just outside of Grand Marais, Minnesota, less than 20 miles from the Canadian border. People don't realize how desolate it gets here once you leave Highway 61. The road turns to gravel, the forest closes in, and even the sound of your own footsteps starts to feel wrong. The locals always warned about the hunger in the trees. It was one of those phrases that sounded like a folksy old saying, until you started hearing the stories. Hikers going missing without a trace. Hunters found days later, disoriented, half-mad, with frostbitten hands and no memory of where they'd been. And in almost every account, the same detail, glowing eyes in the dark. I'd been following a trail that wasn't really a trail at all, more like a faint path carved by deer. My flashlight beam kept catching small details, a broken branch, a smear of something dark on the snow, and footprints. Not boot prints. Not animal tracks either. These were elongated, almost skeletal impressions, each one sinking deep into the snow, spaced far apart like whatever made them had impossibly long legs. I kept telling myself they could be old, distorted by melting and refreezing. But they weren't old. The edges were sharp. And they were leading away from the direction I was headed. Which meant something was out here, and it was close. I tightened my grip on my flashlight, the plastic handle suddenly slick in my gloves. My breath quickened. The silence around me was complete, so complete that it felt manufactured, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Not a single branch creaked. No wind. No distant owl. Just me. And then I smelled it. At first I thought it was just the damp musk of decaying leaves under the snow, but this was sharper, rancid, like meat left in the sun for days. It burned my throat when I breathed it in. I don't know why I didn't turn back right then. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was that quiet, unshakable feeling that if I did turn around, something would be right there, behind me. The trees ahead thinned into a small clearing, their branches clawing at the sky. The moon was bright enough that I didn't need my flashlight anymore, but I kept it on, cutting through the shadows. That's when I saw it. It was crouched near a fallen log, its back hunched, shoulders jutting like jagged rocks under stretched, pale skin. The bones of its ribcage were visible even from where I stood. Its head. God, its head was wrong, elongated, almost deer-like, but with no fur. Just leathery, gray skin stretched over protruding bone. And the eyes. They were the exact color of old ice, milky, but somehow still glowing faintly in the moonlight. It was eating something. I couldn't see what at first, just the way it moved, jerky, almost mechanical, as its jaw tore and snapped. The sound was wet. Loud. Then it froze. The head turned, unnaturally slow, until those eyes locked onto mine. It didn't blink. I felt my knees weaken, my body telling me to run, but my mind screaming that any movement would be the end of me. We just stared at each other. I don't know how long, could have been seconds, could have been minutes. Then it stood. The thing must have been 7 feet tall, maybe more, its limbs too long, arms dangling almost to its knees. It stepped forward, and that's when I saw what it had been holding. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. The face was gone. The forest had gone silent again. Not in the way a forest should be silent, no rustle of wind through pine needles, no distant crack of a branch from some passing deer, but in a way that felt hollow. Like everything alive had taken one synchronized breath and decided not to exhale. I was halfway down the ridge by then, heading toward the frozen stretch of shoreline near Lake Superior's Black River Harbor. The snow was fresh and deep, soft enough to muffle my boots, but not soft enough to hide the sound of my own pulse pounding in my ears. The radio on my shoulder crackled suddenly, and I froze. It wasn't the usual dispatcher chatter. No codes. No names. Just breathing. Slow. Long wet. I grabbed the receiver. Base, you copy? That you, Ron? Nothing. Then the breathing stopped, and was replaced by a single, low, guttural voice. Liora. I swear I felt my stomach fold in on itself. The voice was deep, distorted, like it had come from somewhere far beneath the ice, and yet, it used my name. Nobody at base calls me that. It's Harper, on shift, always Harper. I stood there, the wind starting to whip off the lake, until something else hit me. The smell. It rolled in with the breeze, thick and metallic, like a butcher's shop that hadn't been cleaned in a week. That was when I saw it. A figure, maybe 30 yards down the slope, standing perfectly still against the tree line. Tall. Too tall. Its shoulders hunched forward, limbs wrong in proportion, long enough that its arms hung well past where knees should have been. The head. I don't even know if it was a head. It was just a mass of something pale and bone-like, jagged edges protruding at angles that didn't make sense. The thing didn't move. Didn't even twitch. It just watched me. My instinct was to reach for my sidearm, but my hand wouldn't cooperate. It was like my body knew something my brain didn't, that if I moved too quickly, this thing would be on me before I could even draw. Then, without warning, it tilted its head in this slow, deliberate way, and I heard that same voice, but now it wasn't through the radio. It was right there, in the air, sliding into my ears like a whisper. Cold, hungry. The next second, it was gone. No footsteps, no sound, just empty space where it had been. I backed down toward the shoreline, refusing to turn my back on the tree line, and that was when I noticed something else. In the fresh snow, stretching from the edge of the woods to exactly where it had stood, were tracks. Not boot prints. Not animal prints. They were deep, narrow impressions, and each one ended in long, sharp gouges, like talons, that had cut into the ice-crusted snow. And they weren't melting like normal prints do. They were steaming. By the time we made it back to the snowmobile, the first pale light of morning was beginning to filter through the trees, soft and cold like it had been wrung through a sheet of ice. But it didn't feel like safety. Every shadow still felt occupied. Every sound, the shift of branches, the groan of the lake ice far off, carried too much weight. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see it again, that towering, impossibly thin frame standing in the snow like it had grown there. But the woods were empty. Empty, in the way a predator waits, not in the way of peace. It took us almost an hour to get back to the cabin. Mason barely spoke the whole way. I don't think it was just the cold. I think he'd crossed that same invisible threshold I had. Once you see something like that, it's like a glass pane cracks in your mind. You can't put it back the way it was. We locked the door, dragged the couch in front of it. And we just sat there, in silence, as the storm finally let loose outside, heavy snow, bending the trees, burying our tracks. I wanted to believe the thing had been nothing more than the mind's shadow play, tricks from exhaustion, cold, fear. But the moment I thought that, I remembered the smell. The rot. The way the footprints hadn't matched any animal in Ontario. The way it had known our names. That night, I dreamed of it. It wasn't running through the trees this time. It was standing in my kitchen in Toronto, its antlers scraping my ceiling, its empty eyes level with mine. It leaned forward, and I could feel the breath, hot, wet, on my cheek. And in that impossible voice that seemed to come from the air around it, not from its mouth, it whispered, "Snow falls, you follow." I woke up gasping. The snowstorm had stopped. Mason was gone. There were footprints outside, leading straight into the woods. They didn't come back. And here's the part one never told anyone, not the police, not my family, not even the search and rescue guys who combed the bush for 2 weeks. I still hear it sometimes. When it's snowing and I'm walking alone, maybe to the store or just to take out the trash. The wind will shift, the world will go quiet, and I'll catch the faintest smell of rot, the crunch of something moving behind me, and that same voice, like it's pressing against the back of my skull. It always says the same thing. Snow falls, you follow. And every winter, the snow falls.